Okay, we're good.
Okay, thank you for this introduction. Um, yeah, when you said he longs in this field for a long time, I already feel almost close to retirement. Um, it is, yeah. It started in 95 actually to work in the academic world. Anyway, um, yeah, so thank you. You mentioned already three of my books that are actually relevant to this topic, and um, a number of other book chapters, journal articles that preceded my 2021 Humankind and the Cosmos. Um, all these, sort of indicating my interest in um, nature contemplation or natural contemplation, whatever you want to call it. And this interest actually is with me since much longer time. So it's a personal thing, but it has become also a an academic interest, especially during the pandemic, when I had not only the opportunity to dedicate a lot of time uh, for researching in the area, but also I had plenty of opportunities to practice what I was learning, especially from Clement. So Clement has become now my spiritual master, if you like, and everything I'll be saying tonight, in my case, this morning for you, is both academically grounded and personally. So there's a lot of personal investment there. Anyway, once again, thank you. I don't have slides, but I can share my text with you. Maybe that makes the whole thing uh, easier to follow. Before I begin this talk, I have to point out that during the exchange in the last few weeks with Pui and Andrew, um, I realized that I can develop this in a slightly different direction compared to the abstract that you read
Mhm.
earlier. And without having to change the abstract, I think I'll mention a few things before we get to Clement proper about science-engaged theology. It is my way of trying to frame the discussion, the topic, so that it serves not only um, the purposes of this conversation today, but also the projected volumes, if my understanding is correct, a couple of volumes, uh, which will bring to light our contributions. Now, in her groundbreaking analysis of Clement's multidisciplinary approach to nature contemplation, Laura Riserio characterized this method as una scienza della natura, a natural science. Overall, as we shall see in what follows, her assessment stands. However, it does not exhaust the complexity of the method. To me, Clement's approach resembles what we call today science-engaged theology, in the sense of a theological hermeneutic of nature as described by the available sciences. That said, as we shall soon discover, Clement's method cannot be reduced to science-engaged theology either. The elements of this method are discernible throughout Clement's writings, especially in Stromatis, miscellanies, whatever you want to call it. They are not gathered in one place, however. In my reconstruction of the method, I pointed out that his nature contemplation, or physiology, physiologia, here discourse on nature, is nestled within the second stage of the threefold curriculum that progresses from ethics to physics to divine vision or epoptics. More specifically, Clementine physiology or physics unfolds from scientific analysis to theological interpretation to the spiritual vision of cosmic realities. To advance through these phases, the seekers of truth must acquire virtue, contemplative skills, and sound information about nature, which then they apply to any physical object or phenomenon, as well as to the cosmos in its entirety. That said, only the holy Gnostics or saintly sages reach the third stage of insightful or noetic perception of nature. The latter amounts to a view of reality that exceeds any scientific exploration and theological interpretation alike. In what follows, I discuss this tripartite method of nature contemplation with application to astronomical objects. I bring to light Clement's contribution as the first Christian thinker who engaged Ptolemaic cosmography, which within his theological interpretation features as an alternate view to the widespread heliocentric system. This discussion is introduced by a survey of contemporary science-engaged theology, which will help me establish Clement as a precursor of and an original contributor to this approach. The talk ends by proposing an extrapolation of Clement's method of nature contemplation for the theological engagement of contemporary scientific culture. And actually, I have to apologize. I went too long with the rest of the paper, so there's not much of that, but I hope that we can address some interesting matters while we converse. So, science-engaged theology, past and present. Let's turn to science-engaged theology and its antecedents. The concept was launched in 2021 in a special issue of Modern Theology, edited by John Perry and Joanna Leiden-Hag. That said, as we shall soon discover, certain patristic and neo-patristic thinkers should be credited as science-engaged theologians avant la lettre. I mention neo-patristic as in Orthodox theologians in the 20th century, but this doesn't mean that similar undertakings weren't present in other ecclesiastical and traditional horizons like the ressourcement movement in Catholicism. But to understand why this is so, brief comments on modern science-engaged theology are in order. Working at the nexus of various disciplines, science-engaged theology operates differently from the field of science and religion, except for its dark periphery populated by apologists of all stripes. Science and religion is an academic discipline in its own right, existing as such since the publication of Ian Barber's classic Issues in Science and Religion in 1966. In turn, science-engaged theology moves outside of the field of science and religion, and, as denoted by its framework, approach, and goals, it constitutes a branch of theology proper. As such, it should not be considered an offshoot of science and religion, and I beg to differ to recent statements coming from my friend Chris Knight, who believes that this is still science and religion. I don't think it is. For example, science-engaged theology does not intend to erect bridges for the stranded worlds of scientific research and religious experience to cross, at least not in the first place. Such an intention, nevertheless, is at the heart of the field of science and religion. The interest of science-engaged theology is in showing that the bridges already exist, being implicitly built within both scientific and religious cultures across the spans of history. More specifically, as John Henry Newman pointed out long ago, the mark of both worlds can be discerned upon each other in the, I quote, bearing of other branches of knowledge on theology, and in the, again, quotation, bearing of theology on other branches of knowledge. No news, therefore, in realizing that certain assumptions and axioms of the scientific method draw upon the Christian worldview, including scriptural wisdom. Paul Davies, astrophysicist, iterated this very point, for example, in regard to the scientific concept of laws of nature, of theological origin. In the same vein, Lisa Sideris showed that the concept of Anthropocene is, I quote, beholden to all the philosophical trends, some of which bear the imprint of theological commitments, end of quote. To trace these theological marks upon the contemporary body scientific requires the rise of a theology-engaged science, but that is not the topic of my talk. The impact of scientific ideas upon Christian theology and religious thinking is noticeable too from the outset to this day. The classical example is of the shifts of perspective from the ancient heliocentric model to late antiquity's geocentric worldview and back to the heliocentric system in modern times. The first shift is obvious in Clement, as I show in what follows. Again, my apologies, I didn't spend too much time on that, but I'm happy to provide further evidence. And except for the metaphorical geocentrism sketched by Vladimir Lossky at some point, sorry, there's no reference there, but it's he says this in his book, The Mystical Theology of the Eastern Church. No mainstream theologian would deny the heliocentric model in our day and age. To give another example, no mainstream theologian would assert today that the cosmos has the form of a pancake and that it could be crossed from end to end in a few weeks traveling on horseback. Contemporary theologians think in terms of the bewildering vastness and complexity of a borderline infinite universe. There is nothing new here either. Scientific assumptions are already built into the Hebrew Scriptures and in the New Testament. For example, the layered universe of Philippians 2:10 is of Mesopotamian origin, while the fundamental elements of Colossians 2:20 are of Greek origin. And I'm not talking about mythology here, this is the science of the ancients. No wonder that contemporary science engaged theology together with affirming the importance of interpreting scientific ideas, sets out to study, in the words of Perry and Leidenhag, I quote, narrowly focused theological questions that are already entangled with scientific theories and findings, end of quote. In this light, while remaining a way of doing theology, science-engaged theology is not theology pure and simple either. It is markedly hermeneutical in nature. This precisely is how it functions in Clement's thinking. But before I turn to Clement, it is noteworthy that what we currently call science-engaged theology has been at work tacitly in the background of patristic and neo-patristic theological endeavors for decades and indeed centuries. Let me be more specific. Many early Christian authors articulated Christian theological ideas about the cosmos in conversation with the scientific knowledge of the ancients. In the 2nd century, Ignatius of Antioch, Aristides of Athens, and the anonymous author of Letter to Diognetus, for example, included in their depiction of reality physicalist ideas whose origin can be traced back to Aristotle. In turn, Theophilus of Antioch engaged Stoic physics, while Bar the son of Edessa framed the Christian worldview against the complex backdrop of Mesopotamian and Platonic cosmology. In the second half of the same 2nd century and in the first half of the 3rd one, Clement and Origen of Alexandria copiously engaged Aristotelianism, Stoicism, and various forms of Platonism, Classical and Philonian alike, Middle Platonism. Skipping ahead to the 4th century, while Athanasius overall maintained the physicalist tradition and favored Platonic contemplative approaches, the Cappadocians were eclectic, bringing to bear elements from the Aristotelian, Platonic, including Neoplatonic, and Stoic philosophical traditions on their sophisticated cosmological elaborations, and so on and so forth. Of note is the fact that most of these authors did so unobtrusively, incorporating the available scientific ideas into their Christian representation of reality as a cultural or contextual given, often not even bothering to indicate their sources. It is precisely this seamless integration of science into the theological discourse that elicits the interest of modern historians of science-engaged theology, such as me, for the purpose of understanding the intellectual mechanisms that facilitated this level of assimilation of scientific information. Elsewhere, I pointed out that similar mechanisms were at work closer to our time in the 20th century neo-patristic trend. Here, neo-patristic means the iteration of the patristic or traditional savoir-faire within modern circumstances. While usually the neo-patristic movement is credited with an orthodox ressourcement, largely historical and critical or retrospective, in nature, not many scholars acknowledge its other prospective orientation, where the rediscovery of the tradition's past represents but a stage in the process of implementing the ancient know-how within current realities. Dumitru Staniloae's preface to his Orthodox Dogmatic Theology, written in the 1970s, captures this idea perfectly. In his words, and my translation, I quote, "We have endeavored to understand the teaching of the Church in the spirit of the Fathers, but also to understand it the way we believe they would have understood it today. For they would have not ignored our time the way they did not ignore their own." End of quote. Accordingly, for example, Staniloae endeavored to formulate, I quote, a theology of the world that, again quotation, reconciles the cosmic vision of the Fathers with a vision which grows out of the natural sciences. What resulted was a theology of movement, in his words, evolutionary in scope, a theological explanation, again his phrase, of the universe in expansion. As I had shown elsewhere, this explanation, or rather interpretation, focused on relativity and quantum physics, and on the anthropic cosmological principle. Staniloae's stance was typical for science-engaged theology. What he achieved in terms of drafting Christian cosmology against the backdrop of modern science was matched by Panayotis Nellas in anthropology, while other neo-patristic thinkers such as Christos Yanaras and John Zizioulas addressed topics pertaining to ecology and epistemology. Less consistent undertakings to that end in the 20th century are found in Vladimir Lossky and John Mandor's works, the last major achievement in the prospective vein of the neo-patristic movement being represented in the last few decades by Alexei Nesteruk's contributions, though his grounding in historical patristic thinking is not particularly deep or consistent. The common denominator of these modern Orthodox theologians is, as in the case of patristic thinkers, the deft integration of then current scientific ideas into the Christian thinking about reality. Most of them did not feel the need to explain how their method worked. In other words, what made possible the assimilation of scientific information into their theological narratives, nor to justify their engagement of the new scientific culture. In short, and in eclectic fashion, they selected what they needed from that culture for the purpose of articulating a cogent worldview without debating science. What they either debated or merely left out were the ideological wraps of science, an approach that matched the Hebrew theologians' adoption of Mesopotamian and Egyptian ideas about reality, free of the deities worshipped by those cultures, and the early Christian theologians' manner of engaging ancient natural philosophy without making allowance for the philosophical and religious ideas that piggybacked it. Things were differently, however, in Clement of Alexandria's case, where the rules of both engagement and assimilation of scientific ideas came to be articulated in the form of a rigorous method. It is on this note that I now turn to Clement. So Clement's science-engaged theology. So far, we have seen that there is a good reason for developing science-engaged theology as a way of studying the mutual permeation of scientific and theological ideas. Scriptural narratives and the discourse of most early Christian theologians attest to continuous exchanges between the two ways of making sense of things. Related, we have seen that similar exchanges occurred closer to our times in the neo-patristic engagement of modern culture as an Orthodox Christian iteration of Western ressourcement. Why I have focused upon representatives of the neo-patristic movement is given their affinity with the patristic authors mentioned above, all of whom hailing from Eastern Christian backgrounds. What matters is that as forms of theological praxis, both the patristic and the neo-patristic approaches illustrate the workings of science-engaged theology in the sense of interpreting and assimilating scientific information within the Christian discourse about reality. From this viewpoint, contemporary science-engaged theology is not new. What is new is the rigorous study of the way scientific ideas, especially modern and recent, very recent sometimes, came to be incorporated into theological narratives. That said, there is another aspect that requires closer attention, namely the fact that it is insufficient to identify scientific elements in earlier forms of applied science-engaged theology. To replicate those achievements within our own circumstances, corresponding to the neo-patristic prospective approach, we must understand what made them possible. It is useful to remember here that traditionally the mechanisms at work for assimilating scientific information are implicit, never disclosed as such. It is at this juncture that an examination of Clement's contributions is of the essence, for he did not just practice science-engaged theology. Indeed, he sketched a method and even explained aspects of its workings, sometimes in great detail. In regard to the latter, it is noteworthy that in the 8th book of Stromatis, regardless of the debates about its authorship, Clement or one of his disciples discussed at great lengths the workings of demonstrative science. In addition, I have already mentioned that for Riserio, Clement's method amounts to a genuine science, an assessment I have recently tested in regard to his nature contemplation. It's actually the book I mentioned earlier. So this is the book, freshly published last Friday by Routledge, Nature Contemplation in Clement of Alexandria, Elements of the Method. Okay, back to the text. Against this backdrop, Clement's approach, which will be my guide from this point on, amounts to more than a precursor to science-engaged theology. It constitutes the missing link between scientific inquiry proper and science-engaged theology. Now, Clement's method, meant as a structured way of performing nature contemplation, integrates natural philosophy, theological interpretation, and noetic insight. More precisely, it unfolds in 3 stages, to which I refer as analysis or description, interpretation, and vision. Before anything else, I must point out that, as most of his patristic peers, Clement did never spell out the stages of this method as such, with clarity and in one place. He made several allusions to it. For example, at some point he referred to progressing from the, I quote, lesser mysteries of teaching, mind the theological phraseology, to the, again, great mysteries of the universe, the latter overlapping with, I quote, the highest vision, epoptics, and noetic perception of both nature and the concrete beings. I really love this part of the sentence. It's the comprehensive view of nature in general, or in its wholeness, if you like, and also the concrete beings, the parts and the whole. The passage bears no direct Christian connotations, but what matters here is the idea of a gradual process. Clement detailed this process elsewhere, where he referred to the, I quote, discourse on nature, physiologia, as being guided by the rule of truth. We know the topic was debated a bit earlier by Irenaeus of Lyon, and the Gnostic tradition. That's how he refers to the Christian tradition or the apostolic preaching, Gnostic tradition. And also the highest vision, epoptia, as beginning with the exposition on cosmogony. and advancing towards the theological perspective. That's his phrase. Theologikon eidos. This passage bears the hallmarks of a Christian framework, transparent at least in the points about the rule of truth and the exposition on cosmogony, where the latter is a way of talking about the narrative of creation in Genesis. More precisely here, the method entails phases such as first, physics proper, discourse on nature, that is, analysis and description. Second, interpretation within a theological setting, the rule of truth, the Gnostic tradition, and the exposition on cosmogony. And third, the highest vision, epoptic, also called theological perspective. As I explain in my recent book, the latter here and in many other places is what I call reversed epoptic, corresponding to the saints' divine insight into the nature and architecture of reality. Despite such indirect references, the method is there. In my reconstruction, its three stages go as follows. The first stage of analysis and description makes recourse to various forms of science such as theorizing, experimenting, analyzing, and synthesizing information. For those of you who are interested in this stuff, note 30 there, it's Stromatis 217. Actually, I spent some time in my recent book on this one. It's amazing what he says. Multidisciplinary in its outlook, the first stage makes use of tools and information from across natural philosophy. This tells us something about Clement himself, who, as an eclectic thinker, navigated many philosophical traditions and sciences. No wonder that, while this first step of the method could be completed by most seekers of truth, by way of cultivating wonder at nature through such means as accessing popularized science, Clement and like-minded people bring about a whole scientific arsenal. Let us have a taste of Clement's own view of how various elements of natural philosophy contribute to gaining knowledge about reality. In his words and my translation, integral to science, episteme, are experimentation, empiria, the skill of discerning the classes of beings, eidesis, and grasping what connects them, synesis, together with understanding and insightful knowledge, noesis, ke gnosis. Concerning eidesis, it is the science of what things are generally in regard to their class. In turn, empiria is the comprehensive science that interests itself in the kind and manner of each being. Furthermore, noesis is the science of what is accessible to noetic perception. Then synesis is the science of what is compared or the secure comparison of, or the capability to compare what is the meaning and the science of one being, each being, and all beings that refer to a single category. Excuse the Greek of his phraseology. Moreover, gnosis is the science of existence itself and of what is harmonious in things that become. Anyway, this is again something that I spent some time on, and it's really mind-blowing how multifaceted is his approach to nature, informed by a number of disciplines that fall under the purview of what we would call today natural sciences. Natural science. In this slide, the first step of nature contemplation can take a long time, which is a precious pointer to Clement's interest in gaining knowledge about the world. Indeed, contrary to scholars such as Andrew Iter, Salvatore Lilla, and Joshua Lollar, who suspected Clement of taking the spiritual quest as a way of abandoning the world out of love for the invisible and the ethereal, his interest in the natural sciences and in the world is research tells a much different story. In my recent book, I corroborate this avenue of understanding by marking many instances where Clement produces anecdotal evidence undoubtedly gathered by way of the direct and attentive observation of nature. Mind the pages there, note 34. I thus confirm David Sutherland Wallace Hadrell's point made so long ago that Clement is an outdoor manner. He, I quote, knows what it is like jumping a ditch or smelling the dung in a farmyard. Either way, the goal of this step of the method is to arrive at, in Clement's words, the firm and sound perception and comprehension of reality. While for Clement the first stage is not entirely deprived of theological insight, as for example in matters pertaining to aspects of reality that extend outside the purview of science, the second step of nature contemplation is purely hermeneutical in nature. Specifically, it amounts to the theological decoding and interpretation of the world, which can take various forms. A passage which I have already mentioned about the unfolding of nature contemplation within the Gnostic tradition refers to the exposition on cosmogony, which, following André Mehat, I see as an allusion to Genesis. In this case, obviously, the interpretative process considers nature through the lens of the main scriptural narrative of creation, as the passage points to the theological perspective as the culmination of theology. This seems to denote Clement's desire to ascertain the divine ground of all reality, the world's theological source of existence, meaning, and purpose. On some other occasion, Clement took a simpler tack, but more explicitly scriptural, employing the Ten Commandments as a mnemonic pattern for two decalogues, one of celestial objects and one of earthly things. In his words, again my translation, as an icon of things celestial, the Decalogue includes the sun, the moon, the stars, the clouds, the light, the wind, the water, the air, the darkness, and the fire. Such is the natural Decalogue, physiki dekalogos, of the sky. As an image of the earth, the Decalogue includes humans, domestic animals, reptiles, wild animals from among aquatic beings, fishes, and the whale from among winged beings, likewise the carnivorous ones and the tame ones that desire plant food, and also fertile and sterile plants. Such is the natural Decalogue, physiki dekalogos again, of the earth. This is not strictly speaking an interpretation of reality, theological or otherwise, but it casts light upon Clement's ingenious way of drawing the attention of his believing readers to the importance of realizing the cosmic and environmental dimensions of their experience. Just imagine, he presents these two lists of celestial and earthly things in terms of decalogues, 10 commandments. Yeah, I assume that he expected his readers to learn by heart those two lists. In my recent book, I have analyzed in some detail yet another passage where Clement considered liturgical items through the lens of natural philosophy. The lengthy passage decodes cosmologically such objects as the Jerusalem temple and priestly vestments. To give an example, the priestly vestment which falls to the heels by its length points to, I quote, the agreement that extends from the sky to the earth. The liturgical space is a cosmic signifier. That said, elsewhere I discuss Clement's approach to nature from the other end of liturgical rhythms, where, for instance, the assembly's choir echoes the harmony of nature. Regardless of the interpretative device Clement used, the goal of this second stage is to familiarize believers with the universe and its components, and to bring out the significance of the cosmic syntax that, much the way scriptural narratives do when they are engaged spiritually, is replete of theological connotations. Lastly, the third stage of the method, vision or reversed epoptic, is the province of the saints, whom Clement dubbed Holy Gnostics. Their insight into the nature of reality is neither the outcome of research nor the result of hermeneutics. It originates in their proximity to God's Logos, from whom they learn everything about, quotation, things that are, will be, and have been. This amounts to a comprehensive grasp of reality that is commensurate with the degree to which the saints undertake personal transformation, as this is not only off the charts when it comes to the human cognitive apparatus, but also not of direct relevance to science-engaged theology. I will say no more here. The same is not the case of the first two stages. While the first one refers to science proper and shows how important a sound knowledge of reality can be for believers, the second one brings to the fore a range of interpretative strategies that lead to the integration of scientific knowledge into the Christian worldview and ethos. And the last part of the paper, from Clement's engagement of Ptolemaic science to contemporary science-engaged theology. To have a better understanding of Clement's praxis of science-engaged theology, in what follows I present briefly his approach to the Ptolemaic science of his time. By all accounts, Clement is the first Christian thinker to have addressed what then was modern science. Before that, I must point out that Clement's method of nature contemplation is interdisciplinary, and that it entails the synergy of various fields and approaches, in this case astronomy and theology. Clement was convinced that these approaches to reality are not opposite in their aims. On the contrary, for him, for example, the scriptural Abraham was both astronomer and theologian, continuing to exercise his dual skills all through his spiritual journey. Overall, the two fields seem to illustrate different approaches, which in my book I call from below, or analytical and therefore scientific, and from above, or contemplative and interpretative, therefore theological. Concretely, astronomy represents the ascending disciplinary or analytical approach, while theology embodies the descending visionary or interpretative approach. Given this complementarity, sometimes Clement intimated that astronomy can perform tasks that are normally associated with theology. For example, astronomy led Abraham to the contemplation of God through observing the harmonious and meaningful structure of the heavens. Clement was not the first witness to this situation. Alberto Bardi calls the outcome of this unusual form of cooperation hybrid knowledge, and traces it back to Ptolemy's astronomical musings at the frontiers of philosophy and religion. Clement echoed the approach of his Alexandrian predecessor, whose system of the world became the cosmological backdrop of most of later Christian thinkers, with geocentrism and that. But this is not the only trace of Ptolemaic science in Clement. Back to the passage mentioned earlier about the cosmic decoding of liturgical items. Clement asserted that the temple's altar of incense offering, located in the middle of the outer sanctuary, the holy, signifies earth. The allusion of Ptolemaic cosmography, or to Ptolemaic cosmography, is transparent, since, as for Ptolemy, here Clement's earth is situated in the center of the cosmos, and is the source of all aromas and scents. This might not seem extraordinary, but merely a few lines later he offered the more common heliocentric model widespread before Ptolemy's cosmography. Thus, while the seven lights of the temple's lampstand do represent the seven spheres of Ptolemaic cosmography, but at the center is the sun, not the earth, whereas the moon and the five known planets file to the sun's sides, left and right. And so on. What this lengthy text intimates is that the temple items encode a whole and complex cosmography consistent with the Ptolemaic universe. Of course, given that the temple was erected before Ptolemy, what the aforementioned outlines do is adjust the original liturgical symbols to the worldview of Clement's own time. There is a dual movement behind this discourse, therefore. First, Clement tacitly replaces the worldview behind the temple's ancient symbols by modern Ptolemaic cosmography. Second, he redeploys these symbols as interpretative tools for translating the Ptolemaic universe for Christian audiences. To me, this approach is the perfect illustration of science-engaged theology, and Clement should be credited as a Christian trailblazer on this front. I hope that during our discussion we'll have opportunities to discuss how the same method can be applied to aspects of the contemporary scientific culture, whether it is about cosmology, anthropology, or any other science. And this is where I leave it. Oh, thank you for the applause. You're all muted. I don't hear anything.
Wow. It's incredible. Thank you so much. We now all need to purchase the book.
Haha,
No matter,
please do. Make me rich.
I know, right? £150 or something a copy. Um,
Yeah, terrible.
wow, I don't really know. Maybe I would just kick off with a very overall question that gets to the heart of my interest to just get the discussion going. Do you think that Clement was unusual, or does he self-perceive himself as doing something radically new within what he was familiar with as the Christian tradition?
That's a
Yeah.
very interesting idea and question. Thank you. Well, actually, um, he was at pains to prove that he wasn't original. Many of these patristic trailblazers, really, uh, groundbreakers and so on and so forth, they all said, well, what we're doing is actually just to connect the dots, cross the T's, dot the I's, and so on and so forth. Otherwise, everything is there. It's already there. It's apostolic preaching. But of course, there's a lot of originality, creativity. There's a lot of uh, personality into the contributions of these people. Clement, perhaps among the first to be so bold in creating a system. Of course, we shouldn't take this literally as a system from A to Z, where all things fall in place the way modern philosophical systems go. But it's a system nonetheless, at least in the backdrop of his thinking, as the backdrop of his thinking, rather than an exposition on the surface. But yeah, I mean, I'm certain that he knew that he was unusual. Even the fact that he preferred to call the saints Gnostics, that's his thing. Yeah, Irenaeus would have turned, I assume, if he could have heard him or read Clement's works, would have turned in his grave, to hear a Christian theologian to refer to Gnostics, the G word, the infamous G word. And he explains time and again why he uses the word. What he doesn't say is the fact that he felt the need to counteract the rise and the spread of what we call Gnosticism or Gnostic schools um, during his lifetime, which were very competitive and also very appealing to the intelligentsia. So uh, we cannot uh, not suspect Clement of originality when it comes to this kind of um,
Mm,
challenge. He
mm,
was supposed to bring back or at least make Christianity more appealing to those intellectuals who otherwise were so fascinated by the Gnostic schools.
mm, mm. Thank you. The floor is open. Do you want to go? Yeah, see you.
Oh, thank you very much, Reverend Father Constake. What a wonderful talk and a great opportunity to learn about St. Clement of Alexandria as well. Um, you cited St. John Henry Newman, who, as an Oriel alumnus, I'm very happy whenever anyone talks about Newman's contribution. You talked about this idea, the work, the idea of university, very closely related to the work that you cited, in which he talks about this sort of separation of different fields of knowledge, the need for education to be, properly speaking, liberal, so that it's possible to engage in different fields. And I think this is often cited as an argument for separating between science and religion. You very neatly delineated between science engaged theology and sort of science and religion as such. So I guess the question I was asking is, in Clement of Alexandria, there seems to be this development this three-stage development that you mentioned, culminating in the sort of noetic. So I was wondering what you see as the relationship between these two models of education and how they impact, how you see that impacting the way that we might do science, for instance, or whether you see it influencing the way that we do science at all. Yeah.
Thank you. That's very, very important. Yeah. Well, I don't know if I was able to make this clear in my presentation. But Clement was somehow a believer in delineating the differences between the various fields. So when I say he was eclectic, and that's not my word, it was used many times over about him. I just point out the fact that he borrowed phraseology, stances, information from a variety of sources, which he considered worthwhile in terms of articulating the Christian message. But otherwise, he was very aware of the difference between, say, human knowledge and divine knowledge. That's pretty much what how he refers to what we would call secular culture or the sciences on the one hand, and the theology, spirituality on the other hand. So he didn't mix them. Yeah, there was no confusion there. For him, the autonomy of the fields and the different perspectives on reality was a given, was axiomatic, if you like. This is why the method that I sort of sketched, and it's my reconstruction with the three stages of nature contemplation, draws sharp lines between the first stage, which is, well, let's call it purely scientific. Yeah, there's some theological element to it, because for Clement, as a Christian theologian, reality isn't made of visible items only. There's the logos as the background and final ground of all reality, and so on and so forth. There's a range of invisible spheres or layers of reality, and he needs theology, he needs metaphysics in order to address those topics. But otherwise, his first stage is very scientific, very matter of fact, and he is able to bring information and tools and skills from a variety of scientific disciplines in order to make sense of whatever objects elicited his whatever interest and that. From, I don't know, describing how do you go, a calf, yeah, grows in the womb of the cow. It describes that. So that's biology, of course. It's not astronomy or cosmology or something. But from this kind of tiny, down to earth objects to the highest spheres, astronomical phenomena, and so on and so forth. And he was aware of the fact that he needed pure science in order to get to sound knowledge. He hated confusion. He hated ignorance. I don't know if the word hatred is applicable here or literally to him, but that's my way of, that's how I feel. He despised ignorance. And therefore, he made a point in cultivating the sciences in their pure form, but also showing this amazing capacity for collating information from across the scientific body in order to depict reality as comprehensively as possible. And this was the first stage for him. So in a way, he was very modern in our terms because he believed in the autonomy of the sciences. On the other hand, he knew that theology, and for him, theology was more like a hermeneutical exercise. Theology had its own parameters, its own calling, its own characteristics, and uh, while theology itself could have
Mm,
uh, access to certain layers of reality, its main exercise, at least for the purpose of nature contemplation, its main exercise was the interpretation of that scientific knowledge to make it, I don't know, digestible for ecclesial audiences, for believers.
mm.
Now, the third stage, that's something that goes off the charts, as I said. It's not something that is the outcome of either interpretation, theological or otherwise, or scientific research. It's uh, mystical insight, if you like. If you like, it's something that happens to one in the presence of God. And the more one undertakes personal transformation in fellowship with God, the more one gets access to a level of understanding of reality that is, by all intents and purposes, divine and has nothing to do with human perception, analysis, interpretation, representation, and so on and so forth.
I guess just to follow up, I guess at stake for me is in this question is an epistemological one, namely that when the whole Aristotelian dictum of like being known by like seems to be, at least from my brief readings of Clement, very much present. And so I'm wondering if the end toward which we're heading is this noetic experience, this ability to know this Gnostic to be true, to fulfill our callings as true Gnostics in Clement's words. Does that change the way that we do science? I still don't think that because there is this substantial autonomy to the sort of scientific stage, the first stage, if you like. I don't know if that rules out sort of substantive changes to the way that we do natural science based on a kind of theology that Clement introduces. So
Yet does
I
the
think,
holy Gnostic do better science in virtue of the fact that he has gnosis, he has noetic perception? Does noetic perception improves scientific research? That's the question I'm asking.
Yeah. I got it, and it's a fair question. No, it doesn't change anything in terms of science. I repeat, Clement believed in the difference of perspectives, and he was very happy to build something that, in my world, looks like a transdisciplinary schema. You
Mm-mm.
know, transdisciplinarity is a different beast. It's not interdisciplinarity. In transdisciplinarity, each field has its perfect autonomy, given that each field of knowledge and study and so on and so forth has access to a certain um, um, aspect of reality. Biology doesn't study the stars. Astronomy doesn't study our genes. And Clement operates with this sense of complementarity of various perspectives on reality, knowing that not a single field or perspective will suffice to create a comprehensive image of reality.
Mhm.
So there's need of the insight of the saints, and there's also need of scientific expertise. There's also need of theological interpretation and insight and scriptural paradigms and so on and so forth. There's room for everything. Uh, I repeat, this isn't making some kind of bouillabaisse, whatever, some kind of soup there made of all sorts of leftovers. No, all these elements of the method fall in place where they should, and they have their own relevance for a certain um, stage of the epistemological adventure, if you like. Yeah.
Mm.
So yes, a scientist might become like Abraham. That's Clement's favorite example. Like Abraham, a scientist, an astronomer, yeah, can become a theologian and be exposed to the divine presence. Yeah, Clement observes this beautifully, playing with the name of Abraham before conversion, so to speak, Abram, which he takes as indicative of his astronomical whatever penchant. Abram, he translates as Patir Meteoros, the father whose mind is lost in the clouds.
Mm.
So someone who looks upwards, anthropos, if you like, to go Greek again. Yeah, the being that looks upwards. But in looking upwards, assisted by astronomy, uh, Abram arrives at the conclusion that there's something irreducible to the order of the universe. At this stage, Abram doesn't know who that irreducible layer of reality is, who, not what, yeah, but has this sense of the totally other, so to speak. And Clement says in taking the other path of advancing towards that unknown, if you like, ground of all things, he discovers uh, either the Son or the Spirit or an angelic being. I didn't have time to read that for you. Uh, and definitely this is more of a Trinitarian realization. And at this point, um, becomes Abraham by receiving another Aleph or
Mm.
another Alpha, which, by the way, is also a number, number one. That's
Mm.
one God, the one God above all things. So
Can I?
Abram become Abraham, a scientist and a theologian, a mystical theologian, an intimate of the one above all things, and of the Trinity also, shows what Clement actually believes. That one can keep going to work, applying for grants, doing research, staring all day long in those computers and so on and so forth, and still have a mystical insight, a noetic insight into reality. These complement one another, but they do not supplant one another.
Marie-Lou.
Thank you. Thanks for the talk. That was really stimulating. So my question is actually just, I think, a different gloss on the same theme. And it's what is this relationship between physiologia and theologia? So you're saying, it seems that you're saying that theology is just a certain interpretation of physiology, right? I feel like that's kind of what you were getting at in the third part. And right now you were saying that they're complementary. And my question is, are they complementary or are they interdependent? Right? Can you have just physiology and can you have just theology, or do you have to have a little bit of both, right? Can they exist independent of each other, or do they necessarily build off from one another? So, I mean, to use a bad analogy, like, could this be like an a la carte menu where you sometimes choose one and sometimes choose the other, or do you have to go through like a set menu where you have to start with one and then kind of move into the different levels?
Yeah, that's great. Um, Actually, Clement, in talking about the saints, what he calls holy Gnostics, says, well, some of these people are really educated, steeped in all the sciences, masters of philosophical thinking, of demonstrative discipline, dialectics, and so on and so forth. But some of them are illiterate. And he gives examples of illiterate saints whose insight into reality is so deep that exceeds everything that the sciences of the ancients, the pagans, were able to achieve, or any scientific knowledge at this stage can achieve. In my 2021 book, actually, as well, I sort of refer to this topic from a different angle, I think in 2 or 3 footnotes, explanatory notes, by bringing a witness from a different tradition. The vision of Saint Columba in the life of Columba by Adovnan of Iona. Right from the beginning, but also somehow in chapter 2, a bit later, Adovnan describes either 2 different ecstatic experiences of Columba or 2 slightly different accounts of the same experience. But the experience seems to be the same. In a state of grace, Columba has this ecstatic insight into reality, and all of a sudden he is able to perceive the whole of reality, the universe. Let me think of the phrase, as a single ray of the sun, completely unified. That's a kind of insight that no science can, at least at this stage, produce. Yeah, nothing of that sort was obtained, at least so far. Of course, scientists are looking now for the theory of everything, the grand equation that would explain everything part and whole. But should we actually trust more Teilhard de Chardin than the scientific quest for the theory of everything? Because Teilhard de Chardin believed that only Christianity is able to reconcile the part and the whole. Or, as he said, the person and the whole. And I think Clement would resonate with this kind of thinking. Yeah, there's a big difference between the analytical science, including the science of antiquity, which is able to consider any object from a variety of angles to produce a comprehensive description of that object. Still, any kind of research might fail eventually by not being able to grasp the logos of God behind all things, and who expresses itself through all things. And this is something that Clement actually debates. So on the one hand, you have the autonomy of illiterate saints who have this insight, like Columba. They understand what no educated person will ever understand about the universe. You have also scientists of various expertise and field who understand much more than anyone else, including the saints, when it comes to, I don't know, the minutiae of the processes that happen within a cell, for example, a living cell, or the subatomic world, and so on and so forth, and these worlds can be really independent. And Clement, I repeat, was a fan of boundaries. He set boundaries so that we understand that you can be a scientist, but you can go with your knowledge or discovery and research and so on and so forth, only so much, so far. You can't get to everything. And you can have, scientifically illiterate saints whose understanding of reality is much deeper, very different. But these remain and should remain 2 complementary ways of looking at reality, rather than I don't know, something to cultivate in separation. That's my feeling of where Clement is heading. He believes in both, although he is aware of the superiority of the saintly insight.
Andrew.
Thanks, Doru. Did Clement express at all any caution in accepting provisionality of the latest ancient science, or is that an anachronistic expectation? Because if he didn't, if science was changing and he didn't really care, is he an example of Stephen Jay Gould NOMA, non-overlapping magisterium?
Yeah, I think to an extent, yeah, he was of the view that these magisteria do not overlap. I repeat, setting boundaries. On the other hand, if I understood the first part of your question, Andrew, he did not ascribe eternal value to the science of his time. And this is something very, very important because, in conversations in our day and age in regard to science and religion, whatever variant of it, the critics of any conversation say, well, why should we bother? It is especially the case of theologians. It's the criticism that I hear since my early days as an assistant lecturer in Bucharest to date. Why should we bother if tomorrow the scientists will find the theory of everything that will change everything, and therefore everything that you said yesterday or even today will make no sense or becomes a special situation, a particular case, in a much broader tapestry of reality. And perhaps to an extent that's a legitimate concern, but I don't think that it's ultimately what we need or what Clement would agree to. Why? I repeat, he was a man who responded to certain challenges. They were of an intellectual nature. And he realized that in order to reach out to certain audiences that were lost to the church, he needed to reshape the entire discourse of the church in a way that made sense to those intellectuals. Did he pay too much attention to the science of that age? Maybe. But then there are cracks in the wall. The Ptolemaic system was really a new thing in town. Yeah, Ptolemy died, I think, just 10 years or so before Clement or so. So they were contemporaries, actually. And Clement is the first, of course, as an Alexandrian, he's the first Christian thinker to engage the Ptolemaic system, especially the astronomy of Ptolemy. But he alternates the models, so to speak. Sometimes he favors the established heliocentric system. Other times he refers to the geocentric system, which was the new thing in town, brought up by Ptolemy. And it shows that while he was a man of the moment and he tried to speak the language, including the scientific language of the day, he cracked the wall for alternatives. So on the one hand, it is important to engage the science of this age in order to communicate the message in a cogent way, in an intelligible way, at least for certain audiences that are shaped by that kind of scientific culture. On the other day, yeah, we should take a step back and leave the door cracked, because tomorrow science will change anyway, will shift anyway. I don't know if this answers your...
Curious, yep.
Elizabeth.
Sorry. Yes, hello, and thank you very much. It's fascinating. Would it be possible to send us the paper that you were reading?
Yeah, sure, no problem. It's more of a summary of recent work in the last 3, 4 years or so. There are a few new things there. Yeah, but I have no problem. I'll send it to Andrew and Pui.
Yes, yes, as it, it wasn't. I didn't find it terribly easy to, follow on listening and on the screen. But it's fascinating. You talked about Clement seeing disciplines as autonomous and science and theology as autonomous. I do wonder if that's the best term because it has negative connotations. Theologically, I would say. The idea that anything can be, strictly speaking, autonomous. I mean, complementary, absolutely. I mean, certainly from a Christian point of view, it's a book of the same author that is being read on different levels. And I mean, would anyone in Clement's time, Christian or otherwise, have an idea of science or any discipline being autonomous in the way we understand it today? Science, I don't think anyone thought science was independent of philosophy. As I say, I mean, I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying about his respect for science in its own terms. But I think that given the modern thinking that one can treat it, the sort of Noma thinking, one can treat it as something completely unrelated. I think autonomy might be a misleading term. And related to this, natural contemplation, and I know people that suggested there are different ways of understanding this. Is it only something that that we undergo at a higher spiritual level, or is it also in some sense a practice? I think you're suggesting that in Clement's understanding it's something you undergo, but whether or not, and I don't know whether he talks in these terms, but I think one might well see his whole approach as an application of a certain natural contemplation.
Okay, thank you. Many questions there. First, the topic of autonomy. It's my term, of course. It's not his. I use it keeping in mind the difference between ontology and epistemology. Yeah? I'm certain that for many Christians today, an autonomous creation is abhorrent, at least for Orthodox Christians. I know that's not always the case in other versions of Christianity, but for Orthodox Christians, and I know your concerns, I come from the same tribe, the autonomy of creation is inconceivable. So I hear you. Can the creation be ontologically autonomous? That's the question, but that's not my topic. I used autonomy with reference to fields of study or representations of nature, not to nature itself. So I think this is the short answer to that first part of your comment. Yeah. So it's my term, and I apply it epistemologically, and I'm of the firm conviction that Clement, pretty much like us today, believed in the autonomy of the various fields. In other words, theology doesn't require scientific validation, and science itself doesn't require theological validation. As a matter of fact, he discussed in many places across the Stromatis, 7 volumes, or 8 if you want to include the last one. He discussed about scientists of the time, physiologoi, natural philosophers, who actually were atheists, and therefore their kind of science was by definition autonomous. Yeah? So I am zigzagging through Clement. Of course, I couldn't give you too many details in this short paper. You can get more if you buy, as Pui suggested, my very expensive recent book. But yeah, there were many atheists, and he actually belittled the scientists who closed their minds to metaphysics and theology. He knew that their science could not lead to theology as long as they were motivated or their minds were shaped by atheistic convictions. And therefore, he invited them to change view, if you like, to convert, yeah, and see the other side of things which no science can discover. Yeah, so that's another part of the story. And autonomous science is not only what the last 4 centuries of civilization created. No, autonomous science existed even in the time of Clement, much earlier, you know. Socrates, for God's sake, was asked to commit seppuku because he was accused of atheism. Yeah? So autonomy is epistemologically a reality and historically a reality. What else? When it comes to the noetic perception, Clement wasn't a realistic person. He wasn't utopian. He wasn't idealistic. He knew that in principle, all Christians can become Gnostics because they all are called to get closer and closer to God, and therefore the more they would advance in fellowship with God, they would acquire aptitudes that are by definition supernatural. They aren't familiar, they are extraordinary. And such aptitudes would include insights into the nature, the matrix of reality, like St. Columbus, that have no equivalent in any kind of discursive science or even theology. Yeah. But Clement was realistic, and he knew that not everybody can get there. And therefore, while he praised, and he did so consistently through his writings, praised the insight of the saints, the holy Gnostics, he also, applied pastoral, let's call it pastoral strategies, protocols to encourage people to stay the course. And no matter the achievements, he encouraged everyone to seek the truth. I repeat, one of the things that he returns to time and again is his abhorrent stance on ignorance. I used earlier the word hatred. I believe that he hated ignorance. He believed that no one can grow up in ignorance. He wasn't alone in this conviction. We see even later, say, more acknowledged theologians in the 4th century, like Gregory of Nyssa, saying the same. if you don't want, or if you cannot climb up the mountain, thank you, the mountain of knowledge, then you miss the whole point of your existence. Yeah, Clement says the same. You have to do something, and he sets out to encourage people to seek the truth, to wake up from that slumber, that confusion, the darkness of the mind, first of all, by disciplining their mind through study, through education and study, through research. Okay, we can think, well, Clement was a refined intellectual, one of a kind, and he was perhaps the first major intellectual of this magnitude in the history of Christianity. But we see the same kind of approach later, again in the canonical Byzantine era, with St. John of Damascus, who in his trilogy, The Source or the Fountain of Knowledge, begins his discourse by the so-called philosophical chapters. And he says from the preface of that book, the prologue, that no one can proceed towards acquiring orthodoxy or the right insight into theological matters without undertaking education, without shaping one's mind through philosophical and logical exercise. Yeah. So you have this consistency of the tradition across many spans of history, of the centuries. Either it's Clement or it's John of Damascus, they share in the same kind of mentality. You can achieve something, you can travel towards the truth, even though you might never become a saintly person. And the first stage is education, study, research on an ongoing basis. So he's a fan. Clement is a fan of lifelong learning, and then only so equipped, like Abraham, the astronomer, you can proceed to actually learning theology, which might give you again certain insights into reality that you didn't have before. They might not be what Saint Columba achieved in a moment of grace, or Clement's holy Gnostics who received the mind of Christ himself and therefore know what things were, will be, and are. You might never get there, but you still have a glimpse of reality.
Can I just ask a very brief follow-up on this point? Does that have so in light of his project of kind of getting his audience appreciate education, am I right to say that physiologia is a sort of strategy to reframe how Christians think about the aspect of their faith that is closer connected to knowledge and learning? So going back to Mary Lou's question, which I'm very invested in, the relationship between physiologia and theologia is not merely one that is about reconstructing the disciplinary relations. In a sense, I mean, I can see that the structure of his physiologia already has embedded within it a lot of what he would probably accept to be also part of theologia. But that change implies a different outlook to, it's like Aquinas calling the faith a sacra doctrina, right? It inquires a different outlook. It gives you a different outlook in terms of what is the typical way in which that Christian outlook to life relates to learning and acquisition of knowledge. I mean, is that close to what physiologia is? It's a bigger term that embeds some of what we might call theologia, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, the passage that I alluded to earlier in my paper, the one where he actually uses the word physiologia, in connection with the theological perspective, with epoptics, with the rule of faith,
Yeah.
or the rule of the truth, whatever he says there. That passage defines physiology or physics proper as a science of nature in a very broad sense, which incorporates a trajectory that points towards theological insight, if not what I call reversed epoptic. Epoptic proper, epoptiki, is looking towards the divine. Yeah? But in some instances, Clement speaks of a different kind of epoptic without calling it reversed. That's my term. Where the same kind of divine insight is turned towards reality, and that's the insight of the Holy Gnostics, of the saints.
Mm.
Okay, so in the passage that I mentioned, he defines physiologia, as a science of nature, as being guided by the rule of truth or the rule of faith, guided by epoptic towards the theological perspective.
Mm.
And in the process, there's another ingredient, what he calls the discourse on cosmogony, which after André Mehat and Paul Blauers, everyone thinks it's a reference to Genesis.
Mm-hmm.
And I agree, yeah. The discourse on cosmogony in Clement, that's his idiosyncratic way of referring to Genesis 1, for example.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And this shows that in this setting, in this case, physiology does include theology, does include scriptural exegesis, hermeneutic, divine.
This is a much longer discussion, but Origen doesn't use the term physiologia, and that his understanding of physics, as I've shown, is significantly shaped by Stoics, which means that the Origenian understanding of physics is like much more a Stoic way of understanding the study of the visible world, which enables you to live a life kataphysin. It's a sort of ethical enterprise, and he sort of take it away from the Platonic way of understanding physiologia, which is the way that where Clement's coming from, where even dialectics is incorporated into it, because in the Platonic cosmogony, Timaeus, dialectic is part of physiologia. It's you have to have it. Whereas for Origen, dialectics goes into this sort of Stoic Aristotelian way of thinking, and so he doesn't think of dialectics as connected to apotheia. He thinks of apotheia as spiritual exegesis, which is a very weird way of thinking. That I think is a longer conversation about how Clement managed to develop this in between Philo and Origen, both of whom developed the vision in the exegetical context. And Clement somehow just left very little trace of how he developed this, presumably without exegesis, presumably not without exegesis, but without the genre of exegesis, which hints at his different educational, institutional context, his kind of role, and so on, may be radically different in some day-to-day aspect to Philo and Origen, and that may explain some of the differences. But yeah, this is a longer conversation. Oscar, you haven't had a chance to say something. Would you like to?
Well, thanks for the invitation, and thanks so much, Doru, for this absolutely fascinating paper and conversation. And I really look forward to reading the new book as well. I don't really have a question, to be honest. I enjoyed this so much, but I was fascinated by this kind of back and forth in the discussion, because it got me thinking about, like, it sounds like Clement has a fascinatingly nuanced and, in a sense, balanced approach to those sort of tensions between autonomy and interrelationship and what you call transdisciplinarity and so on. So I suppose that's the sort of thing you ultimately would want to find, because we're talking about somehow this mystery of reality, which it's the same reality, but at the same time, it's not parceled out. So different disciplines in this sense are not parceled down into different material objects, but more like different, very different lenses of looking at things. And on the one hand, there is a certain autonomy, but on the other hand, there's a deep interrelationship. And I was fascinated by what you said about the St. Columba sort of mystical insight into things, which doesn't come from. And I was wondering, maybe would one way of putting it to be that, yeah, what you said in the last conversation on the kind of, or the previous one, in response to Elizabeth's question on the autonomy and the hatred of ignorance and all that. I was wondering if, could you say whether there's something in Clement to this effect, that a certain knowledge, relatively accurate knowledge of the empirical world in the sense of the natural sciences, can be helpful at least in avoiding errors that can then translate into errors in kind of the perception of the world and the sort of theological vision of the world as well, even if theology as such doesn't depend directly on kind of scientific validation. But the sort of examples you gave earlier in the talk kind of gave the impression that, well, early on in theologians, Christian thinkers relied on kind of, there was this interpenetration of natural science. And so do you find anything in Clement to that effect, that he recognizes some sort of dependence of that kind, even though it's not like a complete dependence on the one on the other?
Yeah, it is very interesting, actually. And Clement, one of the most fascinating aspects to Clement's discourse is that he doesn't speak to one sort of audience only. And his discourse is shaped by the audience. Pretty, sound and simple hermeneutical principle, and rhetorical, of course. And it's a different tack that he takes when he talks to believing seekers of truth. He encourages all, believers and otherwise, to seek the truth. But his discourse becomes more, let's call it, integrated when it comes to believing seekers. Yeah, and everything that we have sort of pointed to in this discussion, Marilu, Elizabeth, yourself, Oskari, and so on, has to do mainly with believing researchers, so to speak, where the integration is, let's say, a no-brainer, and you all have to make room for it. And those of us who are familiar with actual scientists, who are also believers, we know very well the struggles of these people to accommodate the two different perspectives in their life, to avoid the Smeagol and Gollum kind of shifting and switching between sides. How do we get to a kind of personal synthesis of these different worlds we straddle? And this is one of the aspects of Clement's discourse. But when Clement talks to outsiders, he operates with those demarcations, those lineaments and delineations, actually, between the fields, what I called autonomy, because he doesn't want to lose his audience. First of all, he says, well, look, it's good what you do. And by the way, has anyone read his Protreptikos, his exhortation to the whatever pagans? Well, that's supposedly one of the early books, by him. And you see how, on the one hand, so after a beautiful first chapter that is very charismatic, come to us, see the truth, and so on and so forth. Then comes a first major part of the book where he demolishes the entire ethical, spiritual, theological system of paganism, what we would paganism. He connects um, misinterpretation of reality with idolatry, polytheism, and then all sorts of forms of immorality. He says, well, that's rubbish, and you should forget about it. Embrace the path of philosophers comes the second part of the book. And he praises the philosophers, the philosophical quest. So it's already the project, the program is already in his first book, Exhortation. And he praises the philosophers for their quest. And he says, well, yeah, you do whatever you can. The best of you, Plato, got very close to truth, but he saw the truth as though through a veil or something like that, as though in a dream, you know. But still, it's good. Keep going, keep going. This will lead you. Okay, thanks, Robert. This will lead you where you need to go, but you need to pursue the quest, whatever, to continue the quest. And then the last part of Protreptikos, of exhortation, is really mystical theology. It's based on the sacraments of baptism and Eucharist, and he says, well, this is where we actually fulfill our goal in participation in the life of Christ. And it's the end of Protreptikos is well, maybe this sounds stupid in terms of comparison, but it's like the end of Dostoevsky's Crime and Punishment, when you have the last part, where Raskolnikov is converted in the presence of a devout and insightful prostitute, and the end of the book is like, resurrection, something similar. Yeah, so different discourses. He doesn't want to lose. He's very pastoral. He's a very good teacher.
Yeah.
He doesn't want to upset his audience. He tells them after a while that, well, do as best you can, but still you won't match our saints. Some of that, So he calls them to conversion, but he's very delicate and very strategic and very discerning and wise in his approach. So this is why to grapple with Clement isn't easy. Definitely not easy. And we have to discern what kind of discourse we want to isolate and circumscribe. Is it the discourse for believers or the discourse for the others? Because these are slightly different. But eventually, it all boils down to this idea. We all need to take those steps, including believers. We need to take those steps of the disciplines, the sciences. He calls them encycliospedia, encyclical curricular education. Yeah, he says, but all that is propedeutic. It is conducive to insight. Yeah, but he says it's still important. And in some instances, he actually says, well, how God prepared, the way God prepared the way of Christ for the Jews through prophets, the same way God paved the way for Christ in the minds and hearts of these classical ancient seekers of truth. He talks about 3 testaments, one of them being philosophy.
Well,
He's very, of course, very creative, very original. But he has a point, because God wants all people to come to the knowledge of the truth, isn't it? Yeah. And Clement, as a disciple, knows very well and applies whatever skills he has very skillfully, very wisely, so that he gets to that outcome.
I think that's a wonderful note for us to end this extraordinary, contemporary yet ancient discussion. I mean, you have really demonstrated how working in the view for many years can produce an integrated vision and synthesis. I mean, I can hear your own kind of work in the contemporary times, kind of intermingled with your historical work with Clement, and it feeds back, and it really it's incredibly exemplary for us to think about how to do this work in each of our own contexts. So thank you very much, Doru, for your insights and for your brilliant scholarship, and for just taking the time to engage with our questions. And we want to thank you for that, and just to wish that you develop this into a much bigger systematic framework, perhaps not restricted to Clement, where methodologically it shows the way of how this work, this period, this body of writers and thinkers and theologians and practitioners and faithful people can stimulate a new relationship, a reconfigured dynamic relationship for science and Christianity. I have not much to say except to thank you all for joining us. And I mean, not very many of us here, but this year we've had an extraordinary start to this community. I'll be in touch again with more ideas in terms of how to take this forward. But for now, I just want to say thank you to Elizabeth, to Oskari, to Andrew, to Sion, to those who have been here to make this possible. It really is a privilege to work with you, and I hope we will continue and take the field forward to make a splash and to open new paths, really, in a way that, you know, the likes of Staniloy and Losky and others would see, wow, finally there's people moving the discussion, and they will, you know, be joyfully celebrating this in the cosmos that they're in right now. So thank you, Doru, and I'll be in touch, and have a good day.
Thank you.
You have a good day. I hope to have a good night.
Yes.
Yes. And thank
All
you,
the best.
Pui and Andrew.
I would just stop.